I received the message on a quiet, foggy night. My old friend Julian had reached out with an invitation to meet in the woods at the edge of town. It was strange, though. I hadn't heard from him in years, and his message was unsettlingly cryptic. All he'd written was, "There's something between us, something left unfinished. Meet me where the path disappears, where questions linger." Now, a sensible person would have ignored it, maybe written it off as some weird joke or even a prank. But there was something magnetic about it. Julian had always been a bit of a mystery himself, someone I'd lost touch with but never entirely forgotten. So despite the warning bells ringing faintly in my mind, I grabbed my jacket and headed out, telling myself it would be quick. A strange reunion, a laugh about old times, and that would be that. The woods were an odd place to meet, though, especially on a night like this, where a thick fog blanketed everything, softening shapes and swallowing sounds. The silence was near absolute, broken only by the faint crunch of twigs under my feet. I walked deeper, and the trees clustered more densely around me, their branches stretching like thin, bony fingers. I kept expecting Julian to call out or come walking down the path, grinning that lopsided grin of his. But the deeper I went, the more alone I felt. After a while, I stopped, squinting into the darkness, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and checked the message again, half wondering if I'd misread it, if maybe he'd meant another spot. But no, it was clear. Where the path disappears. I'd never realized how oppressive silence could be, how it could press against your chest until every breath felt tight. Still, I told myself it was only the late hour, the isolation of the woods. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just a thick line of trees, their shadows stretching long and dark. My pulse quickened and I tried to laugh it off. Maybe Julian was just messing with me, hiding somewhere to give me a good scare. That would be just like him, I thought, shaking my head. But as I turned to continue along the path, I felt it again. Something lurking just beyond my line of sight, barely there, like the tail end of a shadow slipping behind the trees. The wind had picked up now, whispering through the branches, and I could have sworn I heard something almost like voices carried within it. I shook my head, forcing a laugh, more for my own reassurance than anything. "All right, Julian," I called out into the dark. "You've had your fun. Where are you?" Only the rustling trees answered me, their whispery branches scratching at each other. I walked a little farther, glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and every so often, I'd see that flicker again, a shape that seemed to dissolve the instant I turned to look. I told myself it was just my nerves. It had to be. But then I felt something stranger still, a faint prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone or something was standing close, right behind me. I froze, my breath catching. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark spaces between the trees. But again, there was nothing, just shadows and silence. At that moment, I wondered if coming here had been a mistake. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the unease settling over me. The fog was getting thicker, and the way ahead grew murkier with every step. A part of me knew I should turn back, but the pull to find Julian, to get some kind of closure to this strange invitation, kept me moving forward. My footsteps sounded muffled against the soft earth, each one swallowed up by the thick air around me. Then, Just as I thought I'd hit the deepest part of the woods, I saw something, faint shapes flickering ahead, barely visible through the haze. They looked almost like figures, lined up between the trees, not moving, yet somehow watchful. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the trick of the fog, but they remained, dark outlines standing in the spaces between the trees, just beyond reach. I couldn't make out any details, but they were tall, vaguely human-shaped, and entirely still. My heart thudded, each beat louder in the pressing quiet. I strained my eyes, trying to focus, but every time I thought I was getting a clear look, my vision seemed to slip, blurring around the edges of the shapes. "Julian?" My voice came out too soft, barely above a whisper. The fog seemed to swallow the sound almost as soon as it left my lips, like the woods themselves didn't want me speaking. The figures didn't respond, didn't so much as sway or shift, but the longer I looked, the more it felt like they were turning their attention toward me, like a room full of unseen eyes slowly turning in unison. The feeling of being watched turned from vague discomfort to a sharp, almost physical pressure, like the air was thickening, weighing down on me from every side. I took a step back, and as I did, one of the figures seemed to shift, just barely, as if it were mirroring my movement. I could see it more clearly now. It was humanoid, but there was something deeply wrong about it. Its form was blurred, as if I were seeing it through water, its edges wavering and unstable. My mouth went dry. I took another step back, and again, it seemed to follow, matching my movements with an unnatural precision. I turned quickly, hoping to catch it in full view, but it slipped back into the periphery, vanishing the moment I tried to look directly at it. My chest tightened as I spun in place, half expecting it to reappear on the other side, but when I looked back, the shadows had multiplied. Now there were more figures scattered through the trees, each one barely there but very much present, watching me. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of those woods, to forget about Julian and whatever unfinished business he thought we had. But as I began to back away, my heel snagged on a root, and I stumbled, catching myself on a low-hanging branch. In that moment of stillness, the whispers came again, clearer this time, threading through the wind and the silence. They didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. Just broken, echoing sounds that seemed to shiver along my spine, urging me deeper. And then, I felt it. Someone or something was right behind me. My breath caught as I slowly straightened, too afraid to turn around. But in my mind I could sense it there, looming just out of sight, watching, waiting. Unable to bear it any longer, I whipped around. The space was empty, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the shapes again, closer this time, filling the spaces between the trees, creating a dark, watchful wall around me. And in that terrifying silence, it hit me. Whatever these shadows were, they were pulling me in, urging me closer, deeper into the heart of the woods, and I was powerless to resist. I took a shaky step forward, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, each one seeming more solid, more aware of me with every second. The forest was no longer just a place of trees and fog. It felt alive, a place of hidden eyes and ancient, unknowable intentions. And something told me that if I didn't keep moving, if I didn't follow where they led, I might never leave. I moved deeper into the woods, each step feeling heavier, more reluctant, like the ground itself was pulling at my feet. The figures around me stayed in the edges of my vision, pacing me with perfect, unnerving silence. It was strange. Despite their presence, the forest felt more isolated than ever, as if we'd stepped out of the real world and into a place untouched by time. I tried not to look at them, these shadows. Every time my eyes drifted toward one, it would seem to ripple, its edges shifting like smoke. My mind told me they couldn't really be there, that they were illusions, tricks of the fog. But something deeper, something primal, warned me not to underestimate them. After what felt like hours of wandering, I came to a small clearing where the fog seemed thinner. For a moment I thought I might actually be able to catch my breath. But then I realized there was something in the center of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. A small, crude stone altar, covered in moss and twisted vines. It looked ancient, almost like it had grown up from the earth itself. And standing in front of the altar was a figure. Unlike the others, it wasn't just a shadowy silhouette. It had a human shape, with features I could almost make out, though they were blurred and distorted as if it existed halfway between here and somewhere else. My heart leapt as I took a hesitant step forward, hoping it was Julian, or maybe just someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as I drew closer, the figure's face seemed to twist, shifting with every step, revealing flashes of too many expressions, sorrow, anger, pain, all melding together in a way that left me dizzy. The realization crept over me slowly. The figure wasn't Julian or anyone I'd ever known. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure raised a hand, almost beckoning, and I felt myself drawn toward it, compelled by something I couldn't understand or control. The forest around me grew darker, as if every shadow had thickened, feeding off the night itself. A low murmur rose, and I realized it was coming from the figure, a soft, whispering chant that I couldn't quite make out. The sound pulled me forward until I was standing directly in front of it, just inches away from the altar. "Who are you?" I forced the words out, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. The figure didn't respond, not with words. Instead, it reached out a hand and placed it on my shoulder. A chill shot through me, colder than anything I'd ever felt, as if the touch itself drained the warmth from my bones. My mind screamed at me to pull away, but I was rooted to the spot, trapped under the weight of that icy, unnatural grip. Then, all at once, the chanting grew louder, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the shadows around us, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my skull. I looked up and saw that the shadowy figures had closed in, forming a ring around the clearing, their dark forms wavering but solid, like a wall of darkness blocking any escape. A new fear took hold as I understood what was happening. They weren't just observing me. They were trapping me, holding me in place, keeping me from running. And the figure by the altar, the one whose touch left me frozen and numb, was at the center of it all, orchestrating this strange, silent ritual. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break free. Gathering what little strength I had left, I forced myself to speak, hoping, praying that my words would reach them. "Let me go," I shouted, my voice shattering the eerie silence. For a brief, hopeful moment, everything went still. But then the figure by the altar tilted its head, almost in amusement, and its grip on my shoulder tightened. The chanting resumed, louder now, an echo that filled the air and burrowed into my mind. I felt myself slipping, fading, as if my very essence were being siphoned away into the dark. Panic surged, my body fighting against the invisible chains that held me in place. I didn't know how or why, but I understood one thing clearly. These shadows weren't just here to watch. They were here to consume, to draw me into their endless, hollow world. With every ounce of willpower, I wrenched myself back, stumbling out of the figure's grasp, breaking the spell that bound me. The shadows recoiled, as if startled, but I knew it wouldn't last. If I didn't run now, they would close in, and this time, I might not escape. The instant I broke free, I ran, barely registering the pain as branches tore at my skin and roots threatened to trip me. My only thought was escape, to get as far from that clearing, that altar, as possible. But the forest didn't seem to want me to leave. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around me in dense patches, making the trees seem to shift and warp as I moved. Behind me, the chanting continued, that low, thrumming murmur that had drilled into my mind. It was softer now, almost like it was trying to coax me back. But there was an edge to it, something angry and desperate. The shadows hadn't expected me to fight, to resist their strange, silent call, and now I could feel them closing in, their figures gliding through the fog, slipping through the trees like dark phantoms. I could hardly breathe, my lungs burning from the cold, damp air. But I didn't dare stop or even look back. I could sense them at my heels, a pressing wall of shadows that would overwhelm me if I so much as hesitated. My mind raced, trying to understand what they were, why they were following me. But there was no answer, only that deep, primal fear urging me to keep running, to get out. Just when I thought I'd lost all sense of direction, a familiar shape loomed ahead, the old, twisted oak that marked the entrance to the woods. Relief flooded through me, and I sprinted toward it, every muscle in my body aching. Just a few more steps, I told myself. Just a few more steps, and I'd be free of this nightmare. But as I neared the edge of the forest, I felt a strange pull, a whispering voice in my mind, gentle yet insistent. Don't leave. We've only just begun. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to ignore it, but the sensation grew stronger, a feeling like icy fingers trailing down my spine. In the corner of my vision, I saw one of the shadow figures, its form stretching unnaturally tall, reaching out as if to grab me. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, but managed to push myself forward, bursting out of the trees and into the open air. I didn't stop running until I was well down the path, the town lights flickering distantly in the fog. Only then did I turn, expecting to see the shadows spilling out of the woods behind me. But there was nothing. Only the silent line of trees, standing dark and unmoving against the night sky. I doubled over, gasping for breath, half expecting the figures to emerge at any moment. But they didn't. It was as if the forest had swallowed them back up, its secrets hidden once more under the cloak of darkness and fog. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was over, that I'd escaped. But the silence felt wrong, charged with something unseen, like the quiet after a storm that promises more to come. My skin prickled, that same relentless feeling of being watched creeping over me. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no one. Nothing but the empty road stretching back to town. I made my way home as quickly as I could, my footsteps sounding loud and hollow in the night air. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled with the keys, casting one last glance behind me before locking myself inside. For a long time, I just stood there in the dark, listening to the silence, half expecting to hear that strange chanting again, to feel that cold, hollow presence lurking just out of sight. But the house was quiet, still. Finally, I let out a shaky breath and made my way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, hoping to shake off the lingering traces of fear. As I looked up, my reflection caught my eye. I froze, studying the face in the mirror. My face, but somehow wrong. My skin looked paler than usual, my eyes hollowed with dark shadows. I reached up, rubbing at my face, trying to clear away the foggy feeling that lingered in my mind. But then, in the corner of the mirror, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a dark shape slipping just out of view. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Swallowing hard, I glanced back at the mirror. My reflection stared back, eyes wide, haunted. And then, just for a moment, I saw something shift in the background. A dark figure, hovering in the shadows, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The memory of the forest flooded back, the shadows, the chanting, the figure at the altar. I'd left the woods, yes, but some part of them had followed me home. The days that followed were uneasy, haunted by that sense of something lingering just beyond sight. I tried to convince myself that what happened in the forest had been a strange nightmare, or the result of exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the feeling that I wasn't alone never left. At work, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than usual, catching glimpses of shadows where none should be. On the way home, every dark alley, every corner seemed to hold something just outside my line of sight. And when I turned my head, I'd see nothing. Only empty space, shadows shifting harmlessly as night fell. But at night it was worse. It was usually the hour before dawn, that cold, hollow time when everything is silent and still. I'd wake up with a start, feeling an unsettling weight in the room, like I was being watched. My bedroom, cloaked in soft darkness, would seem almost unfamiliar, the shadows deeper, darker. I'd lie there listening to the silence, my heart hammering in my chest, as if waiting for something to happen. One night, after hours of restless sleep, I woke up to a low hum, that same chant I'd heard in the woods. It was faint, like it was coming from the walls themselves, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, squinting into the darkness, my eyes adjusting slowly. The corners of the room seemed to flicker, the shadows shifting and bending. And there by the door, I saw it. A figure stood in the dimness, watching me, its outline hazy but distinctly human. It wasn't moving, just observing with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened as I watched it, too afraid to blink. I wanted to reach for the light, to dispel the dark, but I was paralyzed by its silent, watchful presence. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the figure seemed to dissolve, blending back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the dim room. I sat there, frozen, my pulse racing, the chant still whispering faintly at the edge of my hearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to fall back asleep, waiting for the right moment to pull me into its world. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I hadn't really seen anything. But the memory stayed sharp, lingering at the edge of my mind, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I was exhausted, barely able to focus on anything, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadowy figures circling me, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their whispers pulling me back to that altar in the woods. I thought about calling Julian, demanding an explanation, but a part of me knew it was pointless. Whatever Julian had wanted me to see, to understand, it wasn't something that could be explained. I was part of it now, and whether Julian was even alive to answer was a question I didn't want to confront. The following night, I took extra precautions. I left all the lights on, even the small desk lamp in the corner of the room, hoping it would keep the shadows at bay. But the light did little to comfort me. It only threw new shapes against the walls, new shadows that danced and shifted, as if mocking my efforts. Just as I started to drift off, the chanting returned, that same low, hypnotic hum. It felt closer this time, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house. I got up, heart pounding, and followed the sound down the hallway, each step filling me with an icy dread. I knew I shouldn't follow it, that I was only inviting whatever it was further into my life, but I couldn't stop myself. The sound led me to the hallway mirror, a tall antique thing I'd inherited from my grandmother, its glass dark and speckled with age. And there, in the dim reflection, I saw them. The figures waiting just behind me, their forms blurred but unmistakable. I turned, hoping to catch them, to prove to myself they weren't real, but again, there was nothing. Yet in the mirror they were still there, watching with that same terrible patience, their hollow eyes fixed on me as if they knew something I didn't. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat, feeling the cold grip of fear settle deep within me. Whatever I'd encountered in those woods, it hadn't let me go. As I stood there, staring into the empty shadows of my own home, I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped them. They had followed me home.